It's very loud. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium. My name is Francesco Petruccione, for those of you that don't know me yet, and I'm the director of NITheCS. And this afternoon, I have the really great pleasure of introducing to you Professor Dr. Stephanie Burton. Stephanie is a professor of biochemistry, but for many years she's been involved in doing our national science policy, because she has been here we would call it DVC research. I think in Pretoria is the vice principal at the University of Pretoria. At the moment, she's also the interim director of ASAF, interim president, sorry. sorry. And she was the president of the Royal Society of South Africa, She's also heavily involved with USAF, she's a fellow at the Future Africa Institute of Pretoria, and many other roles nationally and internationally that we could call science diplomacy. I don't know, would that cover it? Yeah. And today she is speaking to us out of her experience in some of these international science forums on science for global transformation. Yeah? And coincidentally, today is, I think, the International Day of Science, Technology, and Innovation for the South, according to the UNESCO website. Yeah. So this is probably a good omen for a very good talk that we're going to listen now. Yeah. So Stephanie, thank you very much for being with us. We are really curious to hear what you have to tell us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, those of you who are here and those of you who are online. Yes, this is a title with many meanings, and I hope that by the end of it you will see why I have called it that. But let me just start with who am I to be standing here? And I have the usual kind of pedigree that academics have, having been through a research career and a university management role as well. But it's a little slow, sorry. There we go. What I'm doing now, really standing in front of you, is the bits that are at the bottom of this slide, which is as an interim president of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and having been involved in a number of other international and national organizations. And at the end of this, you'll see why I have added in there that I am also co-chairing the S20 Science Forum for the G20 Summit next year. So that's kind of the picture of where we're going to go with this today. But the point is, I think that, I'll learn this soon. Here we go. Future Africa, where I come from, is really the foundation for quite a lot of what I'm going to say today. It is a campus which is at the University of Pretoria, but it stands for transdisciplinary science, and in particular dealing with the challenges that Africa faces. That picture is what Future Africa looks like as a campus, and the writing on the left-hand side simply says that Future Africa has as its purpose looking at the challenges of Africa and seeking sustainability transformations. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today. Future Africa is in fact a new campus. We built it on the corner of the university's experimental farm over the last 10 years or so. It now is a fully functional campus with a conference center and residences and so on. That's of course the aerial view. And this really is a campus which stands for sustainability. That's what it looks like. Everything in the garden is edible. So that's Future Africa, my home base at the moment. So it takes a long time. But what are we going to talk about today? Well, I said we'd talk about global science, and it's going to be about the kind of research we need to do, and how can that help? How can we make our research influence the future? Social well-being, economic well-being. Will your research save the planet? Can we influence future economic development? What about the digital technologies? And is all this research that we plan to do ethical? And then a little bit about how we should educate our students. So there's a lot of different questions there, and that's very broadly what I'd like to address in the course of this today. So what are the global trends that are influencing our thinking? Well, there's a lot of them. There's so-called socio-political trends, which are all about what's going on around the world, conflicts and constraints around instability and a lot of uncertainty. There is the issue of the global south. And then the fact that we live in this resource-constrained world. So there are many social and political trends which we are living with. There's economic and demographic trends, the fact that now we have what we call a flat world in terms of information and knowledge, and we have phenomena like the youth bulge in the South and in Africa, and of course, rapid urbanization in this developing world. And then education has changed very significantly in the last few decades. We talk about the massification of higher education, but of course, the big change has been knowledge economy and information technology. And I'll talk a bit about artificial intelligences and open science and open education. And then we have global change, climate change, and we have health challenges. And all of that brings us a strong focus on public health and well-being and an issue around the public trust, which I will also talk a little bit about. So what are the big issues? Well, the big issues are here, some of them. There are very many big issues that we seek to address, but very broadly they're there: climate change and environmental sustainability, global health and well-being, sustainable development and poverty reduction. And what is written there as the bullet points are all of the things that we should be thinking about in terms of what's happening, how are we going to mitigate or address it, what should our policies be, how should we be managing, monitoring? And that applies to actually all three of these areas. How should we know what's happening and how should we decide what to do about it? So if you think about sustainable development and poverty reduction, well, the SDGs talk to that, but there are many, many different aspects. And I think what you should see in this is the complexity of what we are dealing with in these big issues. And of course, there are some potential solutions. We talk about technological innovation and things like artificial intelligences and how we're going to deal with energy. And we have some suggestions. We don't have all the answers. Then there's the exciting area of space exploration and the innovation around that. And spin-offs from that are things like, global communication and tracking, remote sensing, space missions, robotics. And then with biotechnology and genetic engineering, of course, there are many possibilities for using that very broad area of technology to address issues such as hunger and disease. Those are very tall orders. But let's start with the science, right? What do we talk about when we talk about doing scientific research? Well, we talk about science as the pursuit of knowledge and application of new knowledge and an understanding of our world as we look around, and importantly, following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So there's two key things there. There's knowledge and understanding of the world, and there's the systematic methodology based on evidence, which is what science is. And the two key areas we really need to think about are the research and the production of that new knowledge, and then the translation of that information into some sort of action. I'll say more about that in a minute as well. But very broadly, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about doing scientific research, translating what we find in new discoveries into tangible benefits for society. And then that is what creates the transformative change, the positive, purposeful change in our world. So if you look at it in a little bit more detail, starting on the left, we do research which generates new knowledge. We translate the complexity of what we find, and we look for information that will answer questions, sometimes big questions, sometimes quite small technical questions. We transfer that information to communities because they are looking, our communities, our world's communities, are looking for solutions to global challenges, those challenges that I just mentioned. And the science that we do needs to be of value to society. And for that, they need to trust us. So in order for that to happen, we need to communicate. We need to communicate correct information based on evidence, make it understandable, and make it accessible. And having done that, or having made those attempts, we need that information and the communication to go to our policymakers and our leaders. And they're the people who will be making the big decisions. And I'll get to that at the end of this talk. So why are we doing all of this? Well, even though we are in this vulnerable, fragile world, we are looking at what can we do to generate new knowledge, to find answers, to solve problems, to address the challenges that we face in this world, the 21st century digital, complicated, connected, information-driven world. So we need to make sure that our research does have an impact for a better future and to allow innovation that will benefit society. The world's changed dramatically over the last few decades, and in particular over the last few years. So the question is, how are we responding as scientists to all of those changes? Well, we all have aspirations. Our aspirations are, and I'm taking this phrase from the University of Pretoria, to do research that matters. This map actually illustrates the Gini index. The Gini index measures the gap between the very poorest and the very wealthiest of people in a country. And South Africa, as you can see, I'll see if I can make it point there, has the darkest color. That means it has the greatest gap. In fact, South Africa is one of a few countries which have the biggest gap between the very poor and the very wealthy, which tells us that there's a lot in our country that needs to be fixed. And of course, those pictures illustrate some of that. That's about doing research that we aspire to do, which will help to make a difference to our world. And at the present time, we've just come through a global pandemic, which made us change a lot of the things that we did in the way of communicating and the way we ran our work. We have this very rapidly accelerating digital transformation, which is sweeping over the world in a very noticeable way at the moment, but that affects data and it affects how we manage information, and it affects ethics and integrity. And then there's this word that we bandy about so much on transdisciplinary research, and what do we mean by that? And that does make us think about how we interact with communities and, for example, industry partners. But what difference has it made in our lives? Well, we learned some new skills during the pandemic about communication and how to adapt and how to be independent and how to be interdependent. And through all of those changes, I think one of the things that is probably the most important is the idea of collaboration and communication. Because although we spent 4 years working kind of in isolation, we don't actually work in isolation. And we need to take a big picture approach to all these big challenges that we have. So collaboration and communication have never been more important. Now I'm going to look in a little more detail at trends and technologies that will change the way we do research. Here are broadly some major global trends. Sustainability. We probably all think we know what we mean by that. Ethics, data, and transdisciplinary research. Now you can translate those into whatever your field is. My own field is biotechnology. So translating those words, sustainability still means sustainability, which at its simplest is simply the capacity to continue. And that makes for an easy kind of concept around what do we mean by sustainability, the ability to continue. Ethics brings my field to green chemistry, to environmentally benign processes and doing no harm to the environment. Data is what follows and underpins the engineering part of the work that biotechnologists do. And enzyme engineering, 2 words, it's one of those, you know what enzymes maybe are, you know what engineering is, putting the two together makes for a transdisciplinary approach in biotechnology. So I'm sure you can do the same kind of translation into your own field of what do we mean, but I'm going to talk about those 4 broad trends briefly. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the Global Development Agenda around sustainability. You will all have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a research framework. It's an international one that countries have all bought into, and it's everybody's responsibility. So nobody can say that they don't care or will not make any kind of contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are designed to lead to transformative change, positive, purposeful change for the future. We also, of course, have Southern agendas, and we heard today's the day to be thinking about that. But the Southern agendas have some interesting characteristics as well. We have quite unique data in the Southern Hemisphere. We have particularly marked climate change impact. We have issues around things like food security, poverty, well-being, and we have things like African population growth, urbanization, some of the other things that I mentioned as well. So these are all agendas. These are all issues which we have on the list of things to do. So that's sustainability. And we need to think about what is the unique contribution we can make as individuals and collectively. Then there's this transdisciplinary research. What we mean by that is that we collaborate in the development of new knowledge to find new answers to relevant issues, and that we join with academic and non-academic partners to do that. So we integrate different approaches to try to find meaningful outcomes. So that's changed the way we collaborate and who we collaborate with. It's no longer just the professor whose office is next door or down the stairs. It can change how we publish and how we communicate our work. It can certainly lead to a broader sphere of influence. The way we publish and the way we change our policies will mean that we do have a broader impact. And it should mean that we engage with our broad community and the public, and that our work is indeed for the public good. And that also should change how we educate our students. And just because we're in a university, what should our students be learning? Well, they really need transportable skills, because you no longer are in one limited and confined field, and there are many different methodologies to learn. Communication, again, across the boundaries of disciplines and communities. Not being frightened of complexity, dealing with uncomfortable ideas. You know, there are a lot of uncomfortable ideas out there around what we should be doing to improve and to continue with our lives. And we do need to be able to deal with them by addressing them. And then, of course, taking value from all the different perspectives that come from a transdisciplinary approach. And all of that should mean that our students are not frightened of addressing societal issues. So what are the issues that we really need to think about? Well, there's lots of goals and priorities around transdisciplinary research. The things that we need to prioritize are about collaboration and being adaptive and flexible and making a contribution to that sustainable development that we are talking about. And there's as many challenges and barriers to all of that. Communication. I've said it several times, but communication is not all that easy. It's easy when you stand here in front of a microphone and talk on your own, but it's not so easy when you actually need to sit down around a table with people who come from very different angles, and different stakeholders have different skin in the game, if you like, different involvement and a different set of priorities. So that makes for needing new methodologies to deal with that complexity. And then there are issues like resources. Where do we find the time, the money, people who are going to make the effort? And how do we make institutions talk to each other that are not used to talking to each other? And then, of course, there are cultural differences, which we tend only to discover when they become problematic. But these are all aspects of transdisciplinary approaches working together. If you put those two ideas together, transdisciplinarity and sustainability, you come up with an even more complicated situation where we have the challenges of sustainability, some of those big challenges that I mentioned earlier. We have very diverse knowledge systems and very different sets of values. And then, of course, we're all aiming for this transformative change, improving the world, having a sustainable and equitable future. That means that there's many things that can be a problem, that can be a challenge. There are issues around poverty and financial crises and the conflicts that we are seeing at the moment and various natural and unnatural disasters. And all of those mean that there are many risks. So as we go on this path of being transdisciplinary and seeking sustainability, there's many ways where things are uncertain and unpredictable and unprecedented. We certainly 5 years ago did not, or maybe 6 years ago, did not predict some of the conflicts that are going on in the world right now that are making a huge difference to the way in which we work, and certainly in academia making a big difference. So that Agenda 2030 that we're aiming for with peace and prosperity and equity and sustainability, the path to that agenda is fraught with risk. So what are the opportunities? Well, let's take a look at the one which we all, I think, are thinking about at the moment, the impact of new technologies, digital technologies and artificial intelligence. I am very aware that I am speaking at the National Institute for Theoretical Sciences and Computational Sciences, and I am a biologist. But let me talk a little bit about the implications for artificial intelligence, for our research, for our academic activities, for academic freedom, and for public accountability. So we are in this digital, some people call it augmented era. We talk about the industrial internet. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution. We've been talking about that for a long time. A decade, 2 decades, but certainly it has many implications, and all of those little circles show you some of the implications of the fact that we have digital technologies now, doing things like disrupting business and requiring that we take another look at things like security and conflict. So we have digital technologies, we have industries which are modernizing based on those technical technologies. We are integrating big data and analytics and wireless networks and equipment and people. That's the Internet of Things. We were talking a little earlier about the time when your fridge will talk to your phone and tell you what to buy. And your car will stop you from driving too fast if you're being a bit aggressive. These are real technologies that are already being developed. But there are, of course, very many useful networks and technologies which are changing the way we do things, making new ways to connect. And that's not just us connecting with each other, but machines talking to each other and to people and to facilities and to things like transport systems and the way in which information is passed around. This is all part of the Internet of Things. It gives us access to huge data sets. It creates opportunities for artificial intelligence, and I'm going to say more about that. And it allows for things like predictive modeling. These are all opportunities, not threats. And it's exciting. We, of course, have computational approaches to all of these things, and that's, again, not my area of expertise, but I do understand the potential for benefit from all of this. So where are we with artificial intelligences? Well, we're in a new phase, which sort of swept over the world a couple of years ago, where we started to talk about generative artificial intelligence, and we started to worry about what we were talking about. So there's lots of new artificial intelligence that have emerged, and it's having a significant impact on our lives. And some of that's not you. Some of it's already there. The fact that your phone can predict your spelling mistakes and correct them for you before you send your WhatsApp messages. The fact that the internet and smart cars operate, marketing systems, marketing tools, navigation systems, these are all based on artificial intelligence. The fact that Google Maps knows how to tell you how to get to the Nielsen parking area when you've never been there before. These are things which artificial intelligences have already been doing for a while. And they produce language that is really part of our world. Ask Mr. Google. The promise, though, is for new applications and new research techniques and ways of making discoveries. And those systems are coming all the time. You know, we've all heard about ChatGPT, but it's not the only one, of course. So what changed? Well, the thing that changed was partly about data. The fact that we now have available and accessible enormous amounts of data, so-called big data, which comes from many different technologies. And the generative AIs can use that to generate images and text and videos and language, can write you articles, can write you essays. But the point is that those AIs use unorganized data. They don't require for it to be organized for them to mine it and to use it and to find trends out of it. So that's the big difference. They can use large unorganized data sets and generate new ideas. Isn't that fantastic? So these generative large language models, so-called, can work through the big data sets and find trends and patterns, and they can help us with research from that point of view because they can help with information processing and text and writing, and they can change the style of what you say, they can make corrections, but most importantly, they can search for information. ChatGPT, the one that rolls off the tongue, people have all heard about, is a large language model. It also happens to have a chat bot, an interface, which is nice. You know, you can talk to ChatGPT. You can say, hello, how are you? And thank you, and please. And it will respond in an academic way, right? And in fact, I'll show you just now. I used it as an illustration for some of what I'm going to say in the next couple of slides. So it's really feasible to use these large language models for generating ideas. They will spark creativity. The thing is, you just need to remember that they can also synthesize things which are artificial. So you have to still use your own brain to decide if things are real and true. We talk about hallucinations, AIs generating false responses. So how does it help? And what does ChatGPT say about that? Well, researchers, including students, can use those AIs, and you can get help with processing your data. You can get it to show you new insights and new interpretations. And of course, it's very good at helping you with your writing. ChatGPT says it enables advanced research techniques, and it has revolutionized the way researchers approach their work. I actually tend to agree. But students can use these as powerful tools, and I asked ChatGPT what it could do for PhD students, and that's what it said. It does facilitate things like literature review, and it does help you to streamline information and generate research questions, and it can save time. So it's useful. You just need to know that you are doing all these things, the literature searching. You need to be sure about accuracy and plagiarism and correctness. So you need to check. And we need to have better checking mechanisms, actually. It can help with writing skills, of course. And it can help with the clarity of what you're saying. And it can help with new and complex ideas. Well, you have to think about that, whether or not those new ideas would have come anyway, but maybe they come faster. The other thing that they can do is to help you to know what other people in the world are doing without your going through the detailed and quite tedious processes of literature searching. You can find out where other people in the world or other groups in the world are doing work which is relevant to what you are doing in your research. So ChatGPT says it'll enhance your writing, it'll help you with language processing, it'll give you constructive feedback, which sometimes it does, and it'll suggest improvements and help you with synthesis of new ideas, and it'll help you to enhance your quality. But it also says it will help you with collaboration, showing you who you might be collaborating with. It can help you to engage in discussions and share ideas, not only with ChatGPT, but also with other parties that it suggests. And it can therefore help you to connect in an interdisciplinary way. So these are all potentially very useful, but there's a lot of concerns. And, you know, initially universities started to say all over the world, when this hit the news, they started to say, we're never going to let our students use artificial intelligences. It's going to be banned on our campuses. This is just not going to be allowed. Well, that lasted about 2 weeks because you can't stop people from using artificial intelligences. But what you can do is raise the ethical issues: privacy, reliability, bias, and our academic values research integrity, honesty, openness, the appropriate use of knowledge. These are still our academic values, and we still need to hold on to those. And we need to make sure, therefore, that if we use artificial intelligence, we're transparent about it. Say we did it. Also, got to remember that they're not necessarily very good at imagining. They actually are using data, trawling data. So they're not actually imagining in the way that we do. And they are, of course, vulnerable to hacking. So what do we need? We need to maintain our academic integrity. That really is non-negotiable. We need to be informed. We need to know about the capabilities and the potential biases and what are the ethical implications. And we need to be aware what those potential biases might do and be critical. So we should not forget that we still need to train ourselves in critical thinking. And we need some new ethical frameworks around that, which we're all frantically working on at the moment. And our scholars then have this fine line to walk, using AI tools for efficiency, but maintaining authenticity. And practically, our students still need to learn to write. You can't ask artificial intelligence to do all your writing for you. You still need to do that. And to understand about cheating and plagiarism and what's acceptable. And AIs will not replace tutors, teachers, supervisors. They won't. And the need to test the truth. So we don't actually have a magic here. It's a tool, right? And we need those guidelines for publishing, which all the journals are busy developing at the moment. We need to clarify what constitutes new knowledge and innovation. And I think we need to think again about that now, because what we might have thought was new knowledge because we didn't actually have it somewhere else in the literature or out of our data, we have to think about whether the artificial intelligences are producing new knowledge or not. We need plagiarism detection. We need checks on using secondary data because that data is all there in a disorganized way. And so we need new protocols, which will allow us to make sure that anything that's AI generated is authentic and honest. Which brings us on to the whole issue of ethics and research integrity. You know, we have in this country standards. We call them a standard for a qualification. So, for example, for a PhD, that we have a set of standards, graduate attributes, which tell us what a student should have by the time they've finished a PhD. And one of those attributes is ethical awareness in research and professional conduct, which means knowing what is ethical. So then we start to think, well, what do we know? What is ethical? So I owe this to my colleague who is a professor of philosophy and knows much more about all of this than me. But here is what she says. There is a problem of knowing what is the right thing to do. That's a moral problem. You grew up with morals. You had them long before you became an academic. But the ethics part of it is making the best decision about how to address a moral problem. And that ethical part of it is what we do when we talk about ethics. It's a medium. It's a system through which we can make decisions about what's the right thing to do. And the research integrity part of that is what the public expects. It's about using and sharing data and information. It's about things like cybersecurity and maintaining that we do the right thing with all of that. So when we say how we're going to do research and what are we going to do with the data and what about secondary data, those are all issues that relate to the ethics, to your research integrity. And those questions really boil down to who owns the data, the information, who's going to benefit from it, whose knowledge is it? And those are things that we need to bear in mind, particularly when we start to think about transdisciplinary research and involvement of broad numbers of stakeholders and different communities. So ethics is not just about getting ethics approval. I just want to mention research data management at this point because it's one of those very important aspects of all of this. Again, we have a graduate attribute which talks about using appropriately the data and methodologies and processes that are part of the research that you do. And managing research data is really critical. We can do it to our advantage because we have things like AIs and we have repositories and ways of ensuring compliance and making sure that things are visible. But we need to make sure that we know who owns that data and that we can answer to the public who are paying their taxes so that we can do this work. Right? So they have public expectations. They trust that we will be ethical in the way we use data. They want to be able to trust the digital systems and things like cybersecurity. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we look after our data. Okay, so how does ethics link back to sustainability, closing that circle? Well, there's ethical principles around sustainability. And here's just a couple of ideas. There's the choice, or at least the consideration of whether we think about anthropocentrism, in other words, is man at the center of all of this or not? Again, this is philosophy. But if we're talking about a sustainable world and sustainable food production and sustainable economic development, we're really talking about human welfare. And then how does that balance with the concern for the environment? Maybe the environment's actually better off without the people. Yeah, it was. It was. So we need to think about our moral responsibility to the environment. And how do we think about that in terms of sustainability? And then we think about the interconnectedness between people and between people in the environment. And here's another ethical question. I'm not answering them for you. You can think about it. But intergenerational ethics, I find fascinating. We have our own set of morals and ethical principles. Excuse me. But what do we know about future generations? You know, one of the definitions of sustainability is that you leave the world ready for the next generation, or better than it is now for future generations. But we don't know what future generations are going to want because we don't know who the future generations are. So what do we owe them? And what values should we try to pass on? And how do we know what their values will be? So we make contemporary decisions now, which will determine the kind of world that we leave for the future. But we don't actually know whether we're making those decisions correctly. We can do the best we can. So going back to ethics and research integrity then, we do need a purpose for our ethical training. And it is not only about ticking the box on your research proposal that says you have ethics approval from the ethics committee. It's really broader than that. It's about those broad philosophical aspects of ethics and understanding what's research integrity and remembering that the public want to trust us with all those values. So the next step in thinking about that is communication about all of these things. We need to enable our students to communicate, to disseminate, explain their research. We deal with very complex things in the academic world, and we need to be able to make that accessible to the public, to the people who are going to make decisions, and in particular to leaders. We need to learn to address issues like misinformation and false information, which is everywhere. And we need to be able to provide correct, true, evidence-based information. So when we're communicating about our research, we understand we need to do that and that we should be telling people what we've learned. We need to actively share it. And the results need to be available. To be translated into action, they need to be made clear. And we talked about this at the beginning, benefiting society. In fact, if we don't communicate it, why did we do the research? And if the relevant stakeholders don't have an opportunity to use the new knowledge, how will they benefit from it? And if the broader community don't benefit, then, you know, the public have a right to ask why they're paying for it. So ethical science communication is critical. And not only is it about reporting what we're doing, but it's about reporting it correctly. And that quotation, bottom right-hand corner there, that says we should write so that it is possible for the reader, not just for the reader to understand, but so that it is impossible for him to misunderstand us. Our responsibility is to be very clear. That, incidentally, is a Greek philosopher, right? 35 AD. So we do need to think about the way we communicate what we're doing and make sure that we cannot be misinterpreted and that we don't have unfounded assertions based on what we're saying. I think that's a very sobering thought. It's easy to think that we're being clear, but are we? So we have all these expectations, sponsors, mentors, the public, our alumni, our research administration, everybody who pays for it, everybody who wants to understand it. And the expectations are that we will exercise scientific integrity. So as research leaders, we need to do all of that. And as students, we expect our students to learn to study, do research, communicate it, and do it all with scientific integrity. So how do we have impact while we're trying to do all of that? Well, we go back to what I said right at the beginning, the socioeconomic benefits, the community linkages that we have, demonstrating relevance and making sure that our research is translated into applications and commercial and valuable ventures. And that will make us have socioeconomic benefits from our research. So translating what we find into real things. That also involves co-creation right at the start. That means designing the research together with a broad community. And it means having partnerships which will take this forward and engage with what we find and then how we can implement it. So now we got to talk to governments, to government departments, to city management, to agencies like innovation hubs and so on, and explain the value of what we're doing. And one of the things that's a good vehicle for that, but one that we have to manage, is open scholarship and open access. If we make the information that we have and the data that we have open so that it's open to scrutiny, then the public can be aware of what we're doing and we can ask them to trust us and we can communicate it. But we have to be sure that we are respecting what can be open, what should be open and available, and what should not, which information should not be open. So again, we're talking about creating impact by making everything open, but we have a responsibility to do that in an ethical way. Okay, so I started talking about global science. So let's go back to that for the last couple of slides. Global collaboration will allow us to do global science, science for the world. And what we're trying to do means that we need big collaborations and huge resources. I have a husband who is one of those scientists who walks on water and does amazing science. And I said to him, I'm talking about this thing today. And he said, well, all you need is to just tell them about very big collaborations that happen in the world. And he's right. There are some very big systems which allow for big collaborations, big networks around the world. I'm going to talk about one of them in a moment. But we're talking about all these same issues, these big emerging issues of the environment, health, socioeconomic issues, science systems, science in society and for society, and then emerging technologies. These are things that I've sort of covered all the way around, but this slide encapsulates it all in a set of focus areas, which in fact are the focus areas for the G20 summits and the S20 science forums. And these are the big emerging issues sort of summarized that our national and international leaders need to be aware of and that we need to be giving them information about. So the G20 summit is an annual meeting of the heads of state of the G20 countries. There they are. And as it happens, they also have representatives from the European Union and the African Union and so on. But they are the heads of state who meet annually to talk about the issues that are affecting their countries and how they should be planning for the future. The S20 science forums are meetings which involve usually national academies or organizations which represent science in each country. And they are the same countries. And those national academies meet annually, more than once, and have deep and intellectual and sometimes quite fraught discussions. But the purpose of that is to provide scientific advice to the annual summits of the heads of state. What could be more important? Next year, South Africa will be hosting the G20 summit and the S20 forum. So I'll tell you about that in a moment. But very broadly, this is about science-based recommendations. It's about us as scientists giving what we consider to be our best evidence-based information to our heads of state. Now, how's that for a big collaboration and one which could make a big difference? So last year, Brazil hosted the G20 summit and the S20 Science Forum. And this is just to show you that we were there. South African, the Academy of Sciences of South Africa, ASAF, represented there. Myself and one or two other members of the executive of the Academy were there, and part of all of those discussions, which went on for a long time. But what comes out of all of that is a communique. It's a report which has information in it. So there's all the S20 countries with their representative academies or societies, people representing science in their countries. And in Brazil, we had 5 themes that we talked about. And you will see here that they ring quite closely with those big issues that I showed you just now. So there the 5 themes were, and the communique which came out of the Brazil meeting, I actually think, there is a website, but if you just Google, ask Google, you will find the communique that came out of the S20 summit for this last year, which looks at all of these issues. And what's highlighted here in blue are some of the main aspects of what was discussed. The communique is several pages and has lots and lots of words in it. But what it is a set of recommendations to our heads of state about what is important about science. We've been doing this for a long time. The S20 countries have been meeting, and before that, the S7, the G20 and G7 countries have been meeting and discussing. And very broadly, there are the topics. Now, they are the same ones that I used a moment ago in a previous slide, but those are the sort of broad areas in which recommendations are being made to the heads of state around all of this sustainability and the future of society and the future of science, and what do we do with things like emerging technologies. And what's written in the white columns is the sort of subsections of each of those areas. And in each of the S20 forums that have been held over the last 10 years, these areas have to greater or lesser extent informed the information that has been given to the G20 leaders. So there sits the responsibility on our shoulders as scientists. Next year, as I said, we will be hosting, the country, South Africa, will be hosting the G20, and ASAF will be hosting the S20 Science Forum, and our theme will be climate change and well-being. At the moment, that's one broad overarching theme. We will obviously be working on that. Our first meeting of the S20 will be in February next year, and we will start to think, what is it that we host as a new meeting, and what recommendations should we be making to the G20 leaders next year? So in conclusion, as scientists and as communicators, our role is to enable. We need to make it possible for our communities, our scientific communities and our public to identify value and appreciate what is high quality, ethical, scientific practice. We need to enable our colleagues, our partners, our stakeholders very broadly to evaluate for themselves the value and the integrity of our science and the importance of what information we are finding. And that is why when I wrote this talk, I started by quoting this quote, which is that science is as much an act of persuasion as it is an act of discovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for a fantastic talk. We'll have to ask you to please give me your slides, because they read like a manifesto of what NITheCS is trying to do, including all the challenges.
Good.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for Stephanie? And let's start maybe with the audience here in the Nielsen, and then we can see if we have questions from the people online. There's a question here. Sorry, I do my 10,000 discovery steps.
Thank you. Yeah. And so you talk about this integrity of science and so on. And Well, it's always be quite complicated in the consequence of science. One of the things which I really resonate in my mind is this movie Oppenheimer, which he after the Hiroshima and so on, and he visited. He was invited to the White House, and President Truman and General Secretary met him. And then he start to say, oh, because of this, and have a kind of a regret and so on, and try to ban the hydrogen bomb development in Los Alamos and so on. And then there was seemed to be a conflict that Truman said, Dr. Oppenheimer, do you think people care about you? Hiroshima is not about you, it's about me. So that's the thing, when we talk about this. So that's why I always feel if scientists are responsible for all of these social consequences, it's a bit too much. So that's my taking. So therefore, as a scientist, I think our really responsibility is to really push the boundary of science and to the extreme and so on. Of course, there's social aspect, etc. But if we are going to sustain all of the upcoming consequences, it'll be too much.
Yeah. I think what I would say to that is we do need to do what we think is right. And that's at the heart of ethics. We can't predict the future, or at least ChatGPT thinks it can, but we can't actually know what is going to happen, but we can do what we believe to be the moral, ethical thing. And we can certainly make sure that what we believe to be correct and true is made available. I understand that dilemma, and certainly, I mean, we can't know what will happen in a century's time. But what we can do is, first of all, to do what we believe is correct, and secondly, to document it and communicate it as honestly as we can. Yeah. Guy.
Yes, hi, Stephanie. Thanks for some very thought-provoking ideas. I want to maybe question some sort of fundamental assumptions about predicting the future, and maybe put out there that demography is destiny. And I think in many ways we feel that we're in a world that's accelerating uncontrollably. But if you really look at the data, and if you follow a geographer like Danny Dorling from Cambridge or Oxford, one of the two, small universities in the UK somewhere.
Probably
he makes a case that the world is slowing down, that the rate of innovation has decelerated, is decelerating fast. Population growth is essentially slowing down over the vast majority of the planet. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the very few exceptions. And, if you want to think about predicting the future, isn't this something really important that we need to get a handle on? What sort of science should we be doing in order to understand a world in which we are really slowing down? And how do you maintain well-being in that sort of, is that a good thing? And should we stop scaring each other about these exponential graphs and rather start really thinking about a future using the right assumptions? But I don't know how widely this sort of knowledge is shared about the Great Slowdown. He's written a book about it.
Yep. It's a lot the same kind of thinking. You know about it. I have not read the book. It's about making people aware. It's about saying, what we knew 5 years ago, what we knew last decade, we know different now. And we need to be out there saying that. I think that, personally, I think slowing down is quite frightening. But if that's what's happening, then of course we have a different set of information, and wouldn't it be interesting to be able to explain that to our public who are terrified about things like ocean warming and climate change looking as if it's happening very fast. So so our responsibility is to talk about it. Yeah. Leslie.
Thank you. It's always great to listen to you. And in some senses, you've modeled the answer to my question, but the thing that sort of bothers me as part of the research ethics infrastructure in the university is this tick box issue. Like, how do you create ways in which people engage in ethics around science without turning it into a tick box exercise? What are the methods? How do you help people to step back from what's on the form and think about what they're doing?
You know, if I knew the answer to that,
I
and a colleague have got a half-baked manuscript, which is attempting to answer that question, and we're not making a lot of progress. I think it's part of that knowledge and understanding rather than methods and, as you say, tick boxes. And we are far too quick to talk about ethics approval, and just, take it to the committee, get them to say it's okay that you do it this way, that way, and not think another thing about it. But I think it's our responsibility to be educating people right from the beginning, not when you become a PhD student, but to be thinking at school level, what is the right thing to do? And it's not obvious. I mean, some things we think are, but debates around what is appropriate, what is the right thing, and how do we know? I can tell you from 10 years as a DVC that this is the thing that kept me awake at night, was wondering whether the research that was going on in our university was ethical. Was it right? And how did we know? So it's a huge question, but the first step is to ask that question. After that, we can start to say, well, it's not enough just to tick the box, but to engage in the discussions around what is ethical. And what's more, what was, as our colleague just said, what was ethical 50 years ago, not the same as what we consider now.
Okay, so regarding sustainability, you asked some quite evoking questions about what are the future generations' values, do they want this, who they are, what do we owe them? So I just found that really interesting. But then my question for you is, for the G20 summit that you went to, about the topic, the energy transition, what scientific advice or recommendations did South Africa receive?
I didn't hear, what are you talking about? Energy transition?
Yes.
And what do we need? What are we doing in South Africa?
What scientific advice or recommendations did we get as South Africa?
So the very broad answer is that we need to be pursuing renewable energy, and walking away, if we can, from the kind of resource utilizing coal-based, carbon-based energy systems. But more than that, there was also the discussion around the fact that what is right for some areas is not necessarily right for others. So some regions of the world have, for example, big spaces, a lot of open areas. They can do things like wind farms and solar farms and so on. Other places need to be thinking about, for example, nuclear energy. So there was not one answer. What we said is actually what our national kind of direction is at the moment, which is renewables and green hydrogen.
Grace and peace to all. I have to say that was a very informative lecture that we just received from you. I'm actually one of the students amongst my classmates that are here that are doing sustainable development, and we're all first years. And the first question that I have for you, or the only question that I have for you, is that seeing that as we are, the new generations that is exposed to such resources, we have platforms like this where we can learn about such things. what can we do to, I don't want to say what can we bring to the table, but like what can we sort of also work with towards, I don't want to say the older generation that know such things, but like what can we sort of bring to the table, not only theoretically, but like also practically?
There are lots of answers, but the one that I would like to give you is to say, be a part of your community. So you're going to learn theoretical approaches. You're at a university, you're going to read books or equivalent, and you're going to hear about theories. But I think that the thing that we can all do most, and certainly the younger generations can do effectively, is to get out there and find out what the real problems are in your own area, your community area, and find solutions that they can live with or can use and will benefit them and will contribute to their well-being, which is a big broad term itself. But getting out there, so don't sit in the library. Get out there and find out what the real problems are and what the people in your community really think are the answers or could be the answers.
Hello there, Prof. How are you? And thank you so much for the very informative presentation. I would like to ask a question regarding misinformation. As we saw during the pandemic, there's been a lot of misinformation about COVID-19, and there's been a lot of fear regarding artificial intelligence.
Mm.
In your opinion, what do you believe is good ways that we can combat said misinformation and get the public more understanding about some of the stuff we as scientists and researchers are investigating?
There's a very simple answer, which is not going to cover it all, and that is to explain. I think the general public, the first thing I think about the general public is that they're not as stupid as one might assume. You know, they are generally perceptive. So if we can explain clearly and truthfully what it is that we are finding and we are doing and what we know and what we don't know, we can then lay out the pattern for them of where we're finding our information, and perhaps that will build trust, and we can explain what we believe to be useful, good, not good, and so on. It comes down to communication. It comes down to that using evidence, using information, and communicating, which is a two-way process to make sure that people have questions answered truthfully.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that the G20 Summit and the S20 Science Forum will be hosted in South Africa next year. And I just wanted to know, in what capacity can we as students get involved or be involved in both of those things?
Well, let me talk about the Science Forum, because I will be involved with that. We will have, through the Academy, a kind of an open desk, if you like, where people can contact us and make contributions, ask questions, make suggestions, and we will certainly look at all of that. The way in which it works is that it's a relatively small group who actually sit in the room, but they represent big networks. So we in South Africa have the Academy, which represents a big network of accomplished researchers and scientists, but all of them have networks as well. So if you want to be, and the other thing that we have, since you're young, let me tell you, is the South African Young Academy of Sciences, which is for young scientists. And contacting us through our web pages and making your contributions and answering when we call for suggestions, that's what you can do.
We have two questions online. One is from Peter Taylor. And he asks, how do we motivate for trans and interdisciplinary research to funders without being criticized for lack of focus as academics? And it continues, I guess natural and social scientists need to engage much more deeply than we do.
Yeah. So I take a little comfort from the trend that we are now seeing, which is that our stakeholders, policymakers, funders, do recognize the word transdisciplinary now. They may have different interpretation of it, but I think that the message about the fact that we can't work in silos is coming through. It's starting to come through. We have for a very long time had this criticism that if you are very wide, if you spread too wide, then you're not focused. That's true, actually. But I think what our responsibility to that is to defend the fact that we cannot work on a big challenge by taking a very narrow focus. And yeah, so I think that message is growing.
There is one last question by Anelda van der Walt, and she asks, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about academic incentive versus truthfully reporting what we are doing. What academic incentives will help to drive this? Academic publication, as it is now, is not doing that.
Open access, open data. I'm looking at Leslie. He's the editor of the South African Journal of Science. I think if we did not have the same pressure to own our work and to own the intellectual property in our data and our journals, but that we had the responsibility to make it clear what it means, we would be in a better place. Our academic incentives are very outdated, and I say that carefully, but I do think that they are. I think that we need to be changing and looking, and we are internationally looking at definitions of impact rather than citations. And that's, I think, the direction that it will go.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And this impact is also a problem that NITheCS has.
Yeah, we don't have good definitions yet, but we're working on it.
And you know, just as a concluding remark, you mentioned transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and so on and so forth. I have to bring those 8 disciplines to work together to solve some problem. And I promote the idea that NITheCS is undisciplinary. But what is important are the challenges. The disciplines are completely irrelevant. Yeah. Mm. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie, for a very engaging talk that gave us lots of food for thought. Yeah. Thank you very much to the participants online. Thank you very much to you all here. There are some snacks and drinks. Sorry, I'm forgetting the most important thing of the evening. That's why he's sitting here and I still forget. I think it's Alzheimer. Stephanie, thank you very much. This is a copy of Visarku, a magazine that NITheCS publishes, and that was ideated and started by a NITheCS associate, Sophie Marquez, who's sitting down there, and who will tell you everything about it just now. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah.